we all could say this and agree with it also, that life is full of unusual twists and turns. We oftentimes will see things going okay, and then something happens and it really just throws a curveball, and you have to figure out, how am I going to deal with this? How are things going to be altered because of this curveball coming my way? But we're about to see how Haman goes from the height of human glory, being on the mountaintop that he thought, to being to the depth of public execution. Can you imagine this? See, within a literal period of not many days, hours, he thinks he's got it all, and then the bottom just drops completely out of it. And when you think about this historically with this type of scenario, there's been a lot that have had this happen and have seen literally the bottom just fall out. List a couple examples here. Napoleon Bonaparte, on the night of his departure on his Russian campaign, listen to this, legend states that Napoleon boasted of his plans so arrogantly that a woman overhearing him said, "Sir, man proposes, but God disposes." Hearing this warning, Napoleon snarked, "No, madam, I propose and dispose too." A few months later, after making this comment, he had lost over 80% of his army and had to retreat in disgrace. So being upon the pinnacle, being at the peak of where he wanted to be, the bottom fell out of this. Another example we know within history of America, Richard Nixon. We all know this story. Nixon began as a very popular president for his peace Dente with Red China, and for the beginning, the withdrawal out of Vietnam. Very popular. A lot going for him. But his presidency, however, ended in disgrace with his resignation after the great Watergate scandal, which pretty much just put a label over his name of bad throughout the history of the United States. But we have seen Haman here within this context of this story here, humiliated by being forced to parade Mordecai, the man he hated, as an honored servant of the king. And after this happened, he returned home to grieve. His wife and advisors warned him to be careful because Mordecai, being a Jew, would prevail. And let's revisit those verses again. This is Esther 6, verse 12 through 14. "And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh," that's his wife, "and all of his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men unto Zeresh his wife and unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou hast not prevail against him, shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him." And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Now, in the midst, he returned home to grieve. He's grieving. I mean, he has literally just had two different ends of the spectrum on his emotions, where he thought, oh man, I haven't felt better in my life, to where he's walking around and his chin was probably dragging the ground where he walked because of what had happened here. And his wife, and we see here that the king's chambers came to escort Haman to the second dinner the queen had prepared for him and the queen. Now remember, there was a first dinner, and this is where it was Haman, the king, Esther, and there was other people that were there. And now here's this second one, and the only ones that are present are Esther, King Xerxes, King Ahasuerus, and then we see there is Haman. So let's enter into this story. First of all, we see the request of Esther. This is Esther 7:1. "So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen." Now, remember that neither the king nor Haman knew at this point that Esther is a Jew. This is still the greatest hidden secret. None of them know that she is a Jew. Now, Warren Wiersbe said this. I like Warren Wiersbe. Look what he says. When they arrived at Esther's palace apartment, neither the king or Haman knew that Esther was a Jewess. Haman was probably still distressed because of the events of that day. Oh, you had to know. He had to have this in the back of his mind as he came to this banquet. But he composed himself and hoped to enjoy the banquet. Had he known the nationality of the queen, Haman would have either run for his life or fallen on his face and begged the king for mercy. Very interesting. Now, Esther had one purpose in this exclusive banquet that is happening this very moment in this story. To make her petition known in front of Haman. Now, God had all this preordained in the wisdom of her seeking through fasting and praying, that preparation that went through those days. God was preparing her for what she was to do. And I believe that in those days, we spoke about this last week, that He gave her wisdom. And the Bible tells us those who seek wisdom should ask for it. And so we see here that this wisdom has been given, and we see this very importantly here within the context of this story. She clearly had this great wisdom in the way she made the request now unto the king. Now look here at this, the king's prompting. Now the king, pleased by his respectful, generous wife, was ready to listen to her. Now, she didn't take this lightly. She didn't just walk in before the king and just any old way, dressed any old way. No, she dressed her best. She showed that she respected and honored the king for his role. Now look what it says here in verse number 2. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed even to the half of the kingdom. Now, here at the second banquet, the king was probably, more than likely, anticipating Esther had something specific that she wanted to ask him. Now, this king was probably thinking, I don't know what it is, but I'm eager to find out. He had no idea whatsoever about all this that was going on, and he didn't even know about. So, although he had been rash in the past, he was now gracious and generous as he spoke to Esther. Now, he didn't treat Esther the same way that he treated Queen Vashti. No, he didn't. Why? Because once again, like we've mentioned several times before, God is working behind the scenes in this story. All right? And also at this point, King Xerxes had a lot happen to him. Maybe it had worn on his heart. He's not the same individual. He's been defeated. He's had all this money, all these things that he's went through. So maybe there was some change that had happened there as well. But he literally told her in this verse, ask what you want and the sky's the limit. That's what he's saying. Now, wives, could you imagine just for a moment if your husband walked in and said, whatever you want, go get it? Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't that be something just great? I mean, if your spouse said that, just said, oh, honey, just go out and get whatever you want to. The sky's the limit. Oh, that would just, you'd be thinking, wait a minute, what's wrong with you? What's going on? But this is what her spouse said, the king of all people. He's telling her, Queen, whatever you want, it's yours. I'm reminded of a story of a woman traveling in Paris without her husband, and she found a bracelet. Oh man, it was the most magnificent bracelet she had ever seen. Only problem was that it cost $7,500. Whew, it's a hefty price there. Well, she sent a message to her husband, and her husband intended to reply with, no, price too high. However, with the response back to his wife, he left out something very important. He left out the comma, and instead of saying no, price too high, he told her, no price too high, darling. When the lady returned home with her husband and she showed him that wonderful, wonderful bracelet, you could almost imagine that he wasn't as excited as she was because of that mistake. But here we see also Esther's petition. Now, with an audience of just Haman and the king, Esther humbly made her request. Look what it says here in verse number 3. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Now, Esther did something very interesting here. She approached the king with a submissive speech, very submissive in how she responded. Even though Esther was meek in her request, she wasn't a weak individual. But she was showing meekness in this request. The Lord not only gave her the grace to calmly make her request, He also gave her the boldness to declare what needed to be saved. Very interesting. Look what it says here in verse number 3. Then Esther the queen answered and said again, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given at my petition and my people at my request. And you can just hear the meekness in that submissive speech. So here, Esther revealed what? She let the cat out of the bag. What was she revealing here? She's not a Persian. Do you think for a moment the king went, excuse me? I don't know. Haman's probably thinking the same thing as they're all here together. Excuse me, what's going on here? Well, that's a really big cat to let out of a bag here within the context of what we hear here within this passage of Scripture. And we're reminded from Esther that our Heavenly Father is sensitive to our weakness. This is what is so interesting about this passage. And that His strength is made perfect in it. Paul experienced this with God's strength in his weakness, and the promise can be ours as well. Listen to what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 9. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And He said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. That's very powerful. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. And we can claim that same promise today. That's so, so important. So not only do we see Esther's petition, but we see the Jewish plight. Let's look at verse number 4. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondman and bondwoman, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Now, with the words, for we are sold, that's very important, that phrase there. Esther is reminding the king that he had been paid to issue the decree to take out all the Jews. She's bringing that to his attention. She is clarifying this statement, making it as clear as possible to say that he has been paid to do this. Esther's words here echo the actual words of Haman from the decree. She did this in Haman's presence. Let's go back to Esther 3:9 once again. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And I will pay tens and thousands of talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. So once again, she's echoing these words. He was paid. He was literally, Haman was a deceiving individual, but he was paid to take out and send a decree that all Jews should be annihilated. Now, Esther is pointing out that the king would be receiving blood money if this decree is carried. That's what it is. And she continues with an emphasis on the weighty nature of this life or death situation. And that's what we see here and what we read in verse number 4. Now, notice something else here. The king's damage. That's another phrase that's important. For the king to mistreat the Jews, he would bring down his own what? His own downfall. History is replete with examples of nations and dictators brought to nothing because they went against who? Israel. And we see that very thing going on right now, is that God will protect His nation, the nation of Israel. Here's an illustration from the Six-Day War of 1967. Listen to this. Brought a great victory for Israel against her enemies. In May of 1967, Egypt and Jordan signed a defense pact with each other against Israel. Israel responded to this alliance by attacking Egypt's air force on the land. This attack destroyed most of the Egyptian Air Force's aircraft. This victory ultimately gave the Israelis control of Jerusalem. So, with this being said, anybody that goes against the nation, that will be a great downfall of whoever chooses to do so. So that's important to recognize here also within the context of this story. But also, because besides her courage, what is so remarkable in Esther's plea is her diplomacy and her sensitivity. Without pointing her finger at the king, she conveyed as much. She did it from a standpoint of being on his side and showing the vulnerability of her life on the line. Now, she went before the king, and this was something that you just didn't do to the king. You couldn't just come before him and point your finger and say, I told you so, you're wrong, because that would literally what? Be your death. But she did it in such a way that shows her remarkable plea, like I said, in diplomacy and sensitivity, that it did not come across as her doing that. Esther's words troubled her husband, though. I believe they did. And he was outraged that someone would want to what? Hurt his kind, sweet, beautiful queen. And so this story continually evolves. And once again, I say this over and over again, but I'm going to continue to say it. God has got His finger right in the middle of this story. And He's working it out. And that's what's so neat about it. Let's look secondly here, the revelation of Haman. Now, Esther revealed the one behind the plot is Haman. Look at what he see here with Haman identified. This is Esther 7, 5 through 6. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he? And where is he? And at this moment, I can almost imagine Haman thinking, what's the quickest way out of here? How do I escape? How do I get out of here? How do I slime? He literally was slime. I mean, that's what he was. He was just a very ugly individual that had a heart problem. And he was thinking, how do I get out of here? And so the king says, Who is he and where is he? And that durst presume in his heart to do so. And Esther said, the adversity. Man, this just, if you can imagine yourself here, imagine the goosebumps just hearing this. The adversity and the enemy is this wicked Haman. And the king has probably thought, I didn't know. I mean, he didn't. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. He's sitting right before the greatest man that has lived during this empire here, and he's thinking to himself, I once was the holder of the key or the ring, and now I'm nothing. I'm nothing. And so here, to the common observer, it may seem incredible that the king did not know who this person Esther described was. But you know what this tells me? It's so easy. It's so easy for things to go under your nose and you never know it. It's so easy for things to happen and you're not aware that it's going on at all. Very easy for that to happen. But she uses her words wisely. Once again, that word wisely we use here. The adversity, or the adversary, an enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman is indicted. Now, enraged at what he heard, the king had to step out of the banquet to collect himself. He's thinking, this guy, he probably thought, and I'm just saying words, relevant words, he probably thought this clown, this crazy individual here has deceived me, tried to buy me off. He even drank with me. He's probably thinking all these things in his heart and on his mind. and he had to leave the banquet room. This is what it tells us here in verse number 7. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen. He thought, this is my last-ditch effort. The man in control's left. Maybe I can get grace shown to me. For he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. So he was left alone here with Esther. And Haman begins to he begins to beg for his life. Look what it says here in verse number 7. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went in the palace garden. Read this again. And Haman stood up to make request, Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then verse number 8. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine. And Haman. Now, whether this happened, some commentators believe that I don't know, I wasn't there, that he may have tripped, that he may have fallen, or that he was at the point of begging because he knew this was it. Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, he walks in and he sees this man that he's heard all this about, and then he sees him possibly in his mind trying to force himself in his mind upon his wife, the queen. Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now, this is another quote here. This is from Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. It says, we do not know the precise form of the couches on which the Persians reclined at table, but it is probable that they were not very different from those used by the Greeks and Romans. Haman perhaps at first stood up to beg pardon of Esther, but driven in his extremity to resort to an attitude of the most earnest supplication, he fell prostrate on the couch where the queen was recumbent. The king, returning that instant, was fired at what seemed an outrage on female modesty. So he was mad when he walked out, but this right here made him just a fiery man, and he's mad, okay? Now, Haman punished. Let's look at this. Now, conveniently, one of the chamberlains informed the king that the 50 cubits high was already available. It's already available. This has been concocted. It's already available. It's already prepared. Look what it says here in verses 9 through 10. And Harbonah, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold, also the gallows 50 feet high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. Very clear. Hang him. Sort of like, those old westerns or they had those things where they hang them. It says, hang them. Just take them out. Get them taken care of. But here's what we see within the context here. It's interesting, too, that chamberlain made it very clear. He prepared that also for Mordecai that saved your life. So there was another thing that was added to the king's furious attitude, his madness. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. Interesting there as we see that. In a twist of irony, the king had Haman hanged on his own gallows. It almost seems like it's one of those little short stories you watch where the person that thinks they've got someone else, but in the end they fall into their own trap. You ever seen that? We've seen little movies like that before. Then we see here the relief for the Jews. Now, even after the sentencing, there was still a problem. Haman had been taken care of. He's gone. The king had a problem, though. Big problem. His decree was official. It was irrevocable. Remember we talked about that before, the law, the Medes and the Persians, that law, that decree that was given. Once it was given by the king, it could not be taken back. So it's not as simple as going up and saying, hear ye, this has been erased. He couldn't do it. Even the king could not do that. But let's look here at Mordecai's destiny. Now, after revealing her race, Esther told the king her relationship to Mordecai. Once again, there's more cats coming out of the bag. Just revealing all this information here. And the king at this point had great respect for Mordecai's wisdom. Now, if he wouldn't have had respect for Mordecai, may have been a different set of circumstances, but we see how God worked all this out. He respected Mordecai. How could he not? Mordecai saved his life. So all of this is flowing in the direction of the way God wanted it to be. And it's just how all this happened is so interesting and wonderful. Let's look here at Esther 8, 1 through 2. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman, the Jews' enemy, unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman. Oh, you better believe it. He got that thing off that guy before he went. When he went out to hang him, he said, you get that ring off him. It's mine. And so here he had taken from Haman and gave it unto good old Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Wow. Remember we talked about all that before, about what he did and not being recognized? In due time, God will reward. And we see that here within the context of this story also. Just think about this just for a moment. Just days before, Mordecai was the topic of gossip, and now he is the man honored by the king. And Mordecai is not placed in the position that Haman once had with the king's ring. Now Mordecai was second only to the king. He's second only to him. It's very interesting. Psalm 75, verse 6 through 7 says, for promotion cometh neither from the east, nor from the west, nor from the south. But God is the judge. He putteth down one and setteth up another. Only God can do that. John G. Butler said this, God will provide promotions if they're necessary to do His work. You do not need to pull strings, know the right people, bribe the powers that be, or manipulate people to obtain high position. If you need promotion to do God's work, God will see to it that you get it, and you will obtain it in an honorable way. I like that. So let's see not only what we saw there, but the Jews' deliverance. So what about the rest of the Jews? Okay, we see this story. This is very dramatic. We've seen something neat happen here. But what about the rest of the Jews? Well, Esther came to the king one more time to plead for his help to save her people from the awful decree of Haman. This is Esther 8:3, and then verse number 6. And Esther spake yet again before the king and fell down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. And then verse number 6. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? I can almost imagine this picture of Esther coming with just a broken, just a contrite heart before the king, saying, I want to save my people. I don't want them to die. That's what she's coming and she's saying here. And verse number 3 tells us that Esther besought the king. This means she was imploring the king's favor. And there's two ways the king handled the irrevocable decree. Now, how could this be handled? How can you do something about something that's irrevocable? I mean, how can you just do something about it? I mean, the decree has been given. Well, first of all, he does this. The king gives freedom to the Jews. Look what it says in verses 7 through 8 of chapter 8. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. So, while the king trusts Mordecai and gives him authority and freedom to write a new decree in the king's name. Who better than to write this than the man that saved my life? Mordecai used this to write a new decree to protect all the Jews in the empire. And this new decree was given, and the Jews could not be touched. This was to protect them. But secondly, the king allows the Jews to defend themselves. If someone comes and tries to attack them, they have the ability to defend themselves. Look what it says here in verses 9 through 14. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, on the 3rd and 20th day thereof, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces, which are from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces. Unto every province according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing, and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries. Now, I don't know what dromedaries is. Do you know? I was looking at it. Oh, is it camel too? Okay. Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed down by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan, the palace. Now, while Mordecai could not reverse Haman's decree, he did counter it by giving what we've just read here, permission for the Jews to gather and defend themselves from anyone trying to kill them. And this was sent to all 127 provinces. So that means that they were free to defend themselves if someone chose to try to take their life. Now, let's look at the Jews' delight within this. Now, Mordecai was honored with great respect, and jubilation exploded amongst the Jews as they heard this new decree. It's almost like they celebrated, and possibly they started chanting. They may have sung a song as they heard this, and they thought that our God, even though God is not mentioned within the context, I'm just in a way assuming here and just speculating, but maybe they sang a song and said, God has protected us again. And they see this within this, and there's great jubilation. And look what it says here in Esther 8, 15 through 17. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel, blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wheresoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, from the beginning of Esther 7 to the end of Esther 8, everything changed for the Jews. It's amazing to see how much so quickly changed. And as the Jews celebrated the victory that their God had given them, the Persians saw it, and it tells us here, and many of the people of the land became Jews. Now, what does that tell me? It tells me that as Christians, if we celebrate the joy that we really have living inside of us, others will want that. If we walk around defeated, no one wants somebody that's defeated in what they've got. And if you always walk around defeated and you say you're saved and you're always just down in the dirt and you're just always just looking at the bad about everything, nobody wants something like that. If you're always talking about bad things, negativity, no one wants that. But when you talk about how Jesus can change lives and the difference He's made in your life, the same thing can happen. People will want that. Either they'll want it or they'll want to know more, and they'll have questions. And that's a good thing too, because if you got someone wanting to ask questions and wanting more about this change, then they're heading down a good road. And so that's a very important thing. But what a really just interesting part. And we've got one or two studies left of this, but just such an important part, a change within the context of this story, and just good. Doesn't have God mentioned in it on paper, but He's behind the scenes working on it. Any questions anybody's got? Anything that kind of come across your mind?
Well, Israel today is protected by the Lord.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Well, I just think that when we look at our nation as a whole, I mean, it's not going to get any better the way that it is. And we just have to pray, and we just have to pray that our leaders will always continually want to support Israel. Because I think the day that we try to end that, that'll be the day that we, as Ronald Reagan once said, it says, if we forever forget that we're one nation under God, we'll be a nation gone under. And I think the day that that happens will be the day we go under. And who knows what could happen then. Any nation could attack us and completely annihilate us. And so God's been good to America, don't get me wrong, but I believe a lot of that is due to us being supportive of Israel. So, yeah. But any other questions about what we discussed? Or yeah. Yeah. The thing about Haman's family, though, is that they told him. They told him what was coming. They said, you will not prevail against Mordecai the Jew. And so they knew. and he was pretty much setting up his own downfall. But he had a choice. And a lot of people have that choice. And what you do with that choice will ultimately be whether you succeed or you see your own demise. And he met his fate because he allowed himself to get in the way, and his anger that he had. I mean, such a anger. Remember when I talked about that with having that anger and hatred for the Jews? That it was just, the word for that, when you look in the original language, is such a deep hatred. It's just really hard to describe because he hated them so bad, he wanted them all dead. And that's just hard for me to fathom. I've had people that have made me mad before, but I don't think I could ever get so mad to want people, and not just Mordecai, which he wanted to put him as a public display, but he wanted them all dead. And that's pretty severe. That's a big, huge hatred for a people group. And Hitler was like that. I mean, Hitler had just an anger in his heart as well.
The people of Israel have done what the Lord requested in the first place. They wouldn't have all these nationalities in there. He told them to wipe them out. Kids, adults, everybody, wipe them out. And claim the land that I give you.
This is, one thing that I'll say, and then Deborah and I will go back and get prepared, is I think this scenario where she calls out Haman before the king is one of the most interesting, dramatic stories in the Bible, because there's a lot of just really neat stories in the Bible, don't get me wrong, that are really neat. But this scenario here where she comes before a great king and knows what's on the line, not knowing really how the king will respond, and then she literally just points and says, that's the adversary. And I mean, that's just such a unique, just to me, makes this story so just interesting. It does for me, because how bold would that be to come before him? And I mean, he could have lunged at her. I mean, he could have tried, he's got the king, it's just the three of them. So, I mean, he could have tried something, which he would have met his fate anyways, because the king would have called everybody to come in and took care of it. But I mean, what would you feel like if you had to go before people and had to confront someone else not knowing what would happen? But you know you're doing what's right, but you don't know the outcome. And this is what is really unique about Esther. And yes, it's a story about God, yes, but also just about her boldness to come. So that's something that we often forget. Yes, it's a story about how God saved his people, but also about the boldness of a woman, a young woman, to come. And we often talk about men so much, but this is a woman that came before God, but came before the king, and literally put herself on the line, even to the point of risking her own life to save her people. And that's just very powerful. Yeah, yeah. Oh, JL, yeah, yeah. Oh, he came in and she gave him milk, and then she drew that nail, and yeah. That's one of the rare instances, I think, like, I could be wrong about this, but it's one of the rarities where we see milk mentioned, is like she gave him milk and then he got comfortable, and buddy, she just reared back and gave him the old 1-2 with that nail and killed him. Yeah, and then they celebrated her for the fact. All right. We're going to go ahead and go on downstairs, and this just take just a few moments for us to get prepared. And then we'll come back up, and then we'll do the baptism, and then I'll close us in prayer. And once I said, like I said earlier, after the baptism, y'all can go ahead and leave, and then we'll just get dressed and going back out. So, but if you want to come on down, we'll go on. All right. Walt might be able to tell y'all a good story while we're down there, okay?